Think Forward. Think Research Channel.
For a provost, there is no greater pleasure than the recognition of our most distinguished faculty colleagues. We honor ourselves and our university when we honor Daniel Dennett. The recognition of a university professor has happened 4 times in the 150-year history of Tufts University. 2 of them are here this afternoon. Professor Erwin Rosenberg, distinguished Jean Mayer Professor of Nutrition, and Dan Dennett. The 3rd was Alan Cormack, our Nobel Prize laureate, who was awarded a Nobel Prize in 1980 in medicine. If there were a Nobel Prize in philosophy, it would be awarded to Dan Dennett. His writings have touched every corner of the intellectual world. He has transcended the limitations of academic discipline, school, and university. On behalf of all of his colleagues in the 8 schools of Tufts University, I bring greetings, our deepest respect, and our admiration for a truly distinguished teacher and scholar. Let me now introduce our Mistress of Ceremonies, the Dean of Arts and Sciences at Tufts University, Professor Susan Ernst.
Thank you, Saul. I'd also like to welcome you all here today and to thank Provost Gittleman for describing the significance of the appointment of a university professor. After hearing Saul's remarks about the importance of the university professor, one might wonder who can fill these shoes. And from reading your program, I hope you've all had a chance to read your program, it's clear that Daniel Dennett is a scholar who epitomized the university professor. Your program gives you some of the highlights of Professor Dennett's accomplishments. But by way of introduction, I want to elaborate a little bit more about his scholarship. Just from the titles of his books, you have an idea of how active and creative and courageous a scholar he is. Content and Consciousness, Brainstorms, Consciousness Explained, Darwin's Dangerous Idea. These books and others mentioned in your program give you an idea of the importance of his work. But what you don't see in your program, but you can see the next time you visit the 3rd floor of Ballou Hall, and where we have the Dean's bookshelf, where we have a shelf for Professor Dennett's books, you can see the significance of his ideas and how they have spread throughout the world. For Darwin's Dangerous Idea, earlier today, I counted at least 8 translations we have, and I'm not sure that we have them all. Besides the many fellowships and awards that are listed in listed here for Professor Dennett, he's given scores of invited talks and keynote addresses. He's received many honors. He's given numerous radio and television appearances. His scholarship is outstanding, making him richly deserving of this recognition. But in addition to his scholarship, there are special factors that make him ideal for a university professor. Let me just give you a few very simple examples to illustrate this point. Last week in passing, a colleague, who I see here today, said, "What day is Dan's talk?" I think that very simple question says a lot. We have come to celebrate the naming of a university professor and to hear University Professor Daniel Dennett speak. But many of you have come here today to hear Dan speak, our colleague, our friend, someone who attends faculty meetings, who is a good department and university citizen, who we rely on for generous and wise advice. And there's Dan's teaching. The excitement and enthusiasm that he generates in his classes, in discussions with undergraduate and graduate students, are all well known throughout the university. I had an enjoyable meeting a few years ago with some young alumni in Seattle, and we were sitting there talking. As often happens in a group like that, the conversation turned to classes and faculty, and Dan's name came up as an excellent teacher and mentor. And one student reminisced fondly of a wonderful fall afternoon when Dan invited his class to his home to harvest apples, to make cider, and to share stimulating conversation over dinner. It gives me great pleasure to introduce an outstanding scholar, colleague, and teacher, University Professor Daniel Dennett, to speak on evolution, culture, and truth.
Thank you. Back in 1803, William Paley famously drew our attention to the example of a watch. You find a watch in the wilderness, and you know, just from examining it, that this isn't just accident, this isn't just chance. There's a lot of work that went into this, a lot of design work. For Paley, of course, this was the beginning of the argument from design. The best argument, I think, that there is for the existence of God until Darwin comes along and shows how all that design work that Paley so rightly identified in the watch, or for that matter in a living thing, could be done by a non-miraculous process, by a process distributed over space and time, over billions of years and millions and billions of lineages. What Darwin managed to show us was another way in which design could come into existence. And you might say that all design is expensive. You don't get any design for free. To use the modern lingo, we can say the R&D, the research and development, has to be paid for somehow. No miracles at all. Or in the terms that I've used in Darwin's Dangerous Idea, no skyhooks. Now, this lovely artwork was done in Atlantic Monthly a few years ago. And it shows the exemplary skyhook here. It's a miracle. Now, actually, Brunelleschi, whose dome in Florence this is, did have to invent some wonderful cranes to figure out how to get that lantern on the top of that cupola. You can't use a skyhook. You have to use a crane. And some great cranes went into these advances in engineering. Now, as I say, the R&D must be paid for, and in the end, what Darwin shows us, is it can only be paid for by differential replication. That's what settles all questions of the cost of design. That's what pays for the design that comes out of chaos anywhere in the universe. Well, replication of what? Well, of something. Differential replication of what? That's going to be one of the questions that I'm going to look at. The lawyers have a phrase. They talk about cui bono, who benefits? And in the case of evolution, this is always the question. When we see some bit of design, like Paley's watch, but in the natural world, when we see an animal engaging in some unusual behavior or some extra special organ that it has, that didn't come for nothing. What paid for that? What pays for that? Who benefits from this organ? And so we always ask the question, and sometimes we get surprising answers. Consider this ant. We see this ant climbing up a blade of grass. It climbs laboriously to the very top of the blade of grass. It falls down, it climbs again. It just keeps climbing up that blade of grass. And we think, my gosh, who benefits from this? What benefit accrues to the ant for this energetic, difficult behavior that it keeps repeating? What good does it do the ant? And the answer is it doesn't do the ant any good at all. The ant doesn't benefit at all. Well, you think, well, what? You mean this is just a fluke? Yes, it's just a fluke. It's a lancet fluke. A lancet fluke is a tiny parasitic worm that needs to get into the belly of a sheep in order to reproduce. A sheep or a cow, some other herbivore. So the lancet fluke commandeers a passing ant, crawls into its brain, and drives it like an all-terrain vehicle up to the top of a blade of grass to make it more likely that it will get eaten by a passing herbivore. Astonishing. There are other such remarkable parasites that manipulate the behavior of their hosts. One of my favorites is Toxoplasma gondii, which has rats and cats as its alternate hosts. And when it's in the rat, it crawls into the rat's brain, and the rat loses its fear of cats. Astonishing. Then there's Euhaplorchus californiensis, which is a parasite of fish. And it causes them to shimmy and jump and make themselves extremely obvious to passing predators. So this is not an unparalleled situation, this lancet fluke. Well, that's a pretty scary idea. Parasite that infects the brain and induces suicidal behavior. Moreover, it's on behalf of a cause other than one's own genetic fitness. Well, does anything like that happen in us? Do our brains ever become infected by anything that might lead us to forget our genetic interests and engage in some suicidal behavior? What about replicating ideas? Some of you may be thinking of people that seem to exhibit behavior not so unlike the ant. And probably have in mind the same people I do. Our fellow citizens in New Hampshire. Live free or die. In fact, there are more than a few ideas to die for, worth dying for. People have died for freedom, for truth, for justice, for communism and for capitalism, for Catholicism and for Islam. All of these ideas and many more that we could name are truly infectious. They spread to many human brains, and these hosts then work very hard to spread them to others. In fact, we're the only species that so routinely sets aside genetic interest and devotes our energy, our time, our lives to the furtherance of one idea or another. In fact, one such idea, which I'm myself fond of, if you need a sound bite, as a philosophers often need sound bites. You're asked, you're a philosopher? Tell us your philosophy of life. Something like that. What do you do at a time like that? Well, one of my favorites is The Secret of Happiness, which is find something more important than you are and dedicate yourself to it. That very idea, of course, makes it more likely that people will find just such an idea and do that. Now, this idea about replicating ideas that can infect our brains is the idea that is commonly written about today using the term memes, which is due to Richard Dawkins in his book The Selfish Gene, 1976. Memes, Dawkins proposes, are analogous to genes. They are, if the differential replication of genes is what pays for all design in the biosphere, that is, in the pre-human, pre-cultural biosphere, then differential replication of memes is what explains the design patterns that we observe in human culture. So now we have the first two of the three ideas in my title: evolution, culture, and truth. But we're not a third of the way through yet. Memes, then, are like genes. They are replicating entities in any cultural medium, of which there are more than a few. Now, they have vehicles or phenotypes. That is, they differ in their properties that are relevant to their replication. As Dawkins has put it, they're like viruses. Now, what's a virus? Well, it's a bit of nucleic acid. It is not just any old bit of nucleic acid. A virus is just a string of nucleic acid with attitude. That is to say, there's something about it, about the particular nucleic acid that it provokes its own replication. Viruses travel light. They don't carry their reproductive machinery with them. They usurp the reproductive machinery, the replicative machinery in other cells. They enter a cell, commandeer the machinery, and make lots of copies of themselves. Now, a meme is like a virus, then. It's an information packet with attitude, in just the same sense. Something about it that favors its replication over the alternatives. Now, many people I know are extremely dubious, not to say leery of memes. I find that few ideas in the general arena of academia provoke as much hostility as I've encountered when talking about memes. And one of the objections one hears is, well, unlike genes, which are, made of DNA, memes aren't made of anything. Well, it's made of information which can be carried in really any physical medium. Genes, I might add, are also made of information. They happen typically to be riding in the vehicles of DNA molecules, but that's not what they are. They're not the DNA, they're the information in the DNA. And I find that people who don't have particular ontological or metaphysical scruples about other things can get very metaphysically scrupulous about memes and decide that they're not proper things. Well, what's a word made of? How many of you include in your ontology words? How many of you think that among the things there are words? Hands? Yeah. Now, of course, some particularly hard-headed, skeptical ontologists may say, no, words don't really exist. It's a hard sell. Words are pretty good things. You can have sciences of words. And words are a species of memes. They are a subspecies of memes. Words are memes that can be pronounced. That's it. There's plenty of other memes which can't be pronounced. They're not words. They're all sorts of things. They have the same ontological status as words. Words aren't made of chalk or ink. They're not made of acoustic waves. But they're just as real as they can be. They are an abstract category, and memes are the same sort of thing. They're not really like anything else. This cartoon appeared in the Tufts paper just a few days ago. Who called this meeting? We thought you did. I think we should discuss issues and assign tasks so it's not a complete waste of time. Dilbert says, maybe meetings have become a life form capable of calling themselves and thus reproducing via human hosts. Good issue. Wow. So Dilbert has caught the meme. And at least one of his characters expresses awe but many others I know really hate the idea. But I'm not, on this occasion, going to devote my time to a defense of memes, because I've done that elsewhere and at considerable length in Darwin's Dangerous Idea, but also in a bunch of other forthcoming or just out essays. And I will put this slide up again at the end in case anybody's interested in seeing what my latest defense of memes comes to. I'm just going to set that aside and proceed. I want to proceed, first of all, by looking at the feature of memes that I think is the most disconcerting to many people, but also the one that makes the idea so powerful, in my opinion. I want to draw your attention to a particular set of memes, which is well represented in New Hampshire, by the way, and that's the Shakers. As you no doubt know, this now basically extinct religious sect had among their tenets the celibacy of not just their priests, but of all Shakers. All Shakers were to abstain from procreation. Well, it's not any wonder, is it, that they're extinct? You sort of think, this is not a wise move. If you're starting a religion, you might think, to prohibit reproduction of the believers. But in fact, the extinction, if that's quite what the right word of the Shakers, had nothing to do, really, or very little to do with this feature of their ideology. What happened was that the social circumstances in America changed, and their supply of converts dried up. Before the sort of social services safety nets were in place, there were lots of widows and orphans that they could take in and then raise as Shakers. And when their supply of widows and orphans dried up, then that's when their numbers began to diminish. Once we appreciate that, we can appreciate some interesting factors about the Shaker memes. First of all, they do indeed reduce genetic fitness to 0. You don't have any grandchildren at all if you are a good Shaker. So there's no question, this is, from the point of view of genetics, a deleterious addition to your kit. Nevertheless, Shaker memes may still be fit in their own terms. That is to say, their own replicative success is the measure of their own fitness, and that is simply independent of the replicative success of their hosts. We can imagine, as philosophers do in a thought experiment, we'll imagine super Shakers who, like Shakers, have strict celibacy as a cardinal doctrine, but who happen to have a more effective proselytizing set of tools than the Shakers themselves have. Suppose such a sect arose, and suppose that it kept going for 1,000 years, replenishing its membership on a yearly or weekly basis by new converts, never ever passing on the memes vertically, as one would say in biology, from parent to child, but always by oblique and horizontal transmission. There's nothing in biology to prevent a sect of super Shakers from lasting for 1,000 years or longer. And if so, the explanation of what was responsible for that would cite the fitness not of the Shakers. Their fitness, their genetic fitness is 0 in all cases. This is exactly like those parasites, of which some are known, which render the host sterile. Nevertheless, they can survive and flourish if they can manage to jump to new hosts with great regularity. It's their own replicative fitness, their own replicative prowess against the competition that matters. So here's the idea. It's the idea, an idea can flourish in spite of having a negative impact on genetic fitness. Many approaches to cultural evolution and to co-evolution of culture and biology by Mark Feldman and Luca Cavalli-Sforza, for instance, and Richardson and I've suddenly forgotten Richardson's colleague, Boyd and Richardson, make, I think, the mistake of treating cultural items as always or almost always fitness-enhancing bits of plasticity. In other words, good tricks which enhance the fitness of their hosts. And this means that they can only treat those that don't enhance genetic fitness as a sort of mistake, as noise, as sampling error, as oddball, as grit in the machinery rather than as an interesting phenomenon in their own right. One of the main reasons I think that the memes approach is useful is it allows us to look at how different the horizontal and oblique transmission of ideas can be, in that they are much more likely to be not only independent of genetic fitness, but sometimes positively hostile, in much the manner that parasites can be. Well, now, with that as background, I think we can see why a ruthlessly evolutionary approach to culture looks pretty dismal to many people, particularly people in the humanities who don't find this an attractive vision at all. Our brains are just meme nests. They're just infested with all these parasites that are competing to replicate. Not a very appealing vision in many regards of what our human cultures are all about. And it is sometimes suggested that a thoroughly evolutionary approach to culture undercuts itself and becomes, in some sense, self-stultifying. Why? Well, because there's no necessary connection between the fitness of a meme and the benefit or cost to its hosts. That's the point we've just made. And at this point, we're ready for the third theme. What about truth? Isn't it the case that if you take this evolutionary approach to cultural objects, you must somehow forego any evaluation of culture which finds some cultural items to be more endowed with truth, more likely to lead to the truth, and so forth. Truth? I can hear postmodernists chuckling and saying, truth? What? Do we have truth worship here? Do we have just another religion? Truth worship is just one among those many memes that might get spread. There's nothing special about it, presumably. Well, is there anything special about truth? The mathematician and physicist and thinker outside the box, Paul Barrow, once said, mathematics is the only religion that can prove it is religion. And there's something nicely paradoxical about this claim, because if it can prove anything, I don't think it's a religion. And what I'm going to, just so you know where I'm headed, truth is real. Truth trumps the competition. I'm going to be devoting the rest of the talk to showing how there is room for evaluations of cultural differences, cultural ideas, in terms of truth and falsity. How truth is, if you like, a marked. It is not a category that is abandoned when you look at either the biosphere or the cultural memosphere through evolutionary spectacles. Right now, as we speak, untold billions or trillions of organisms are playing hide and seek. And they've been doing it for billions of years, and their lives depend on it. Some win and some lose. Getting it wrong leads to being brunch. That is to say, our bodies all end up nourishing some critters or other. It's the premature, it's the early nourishment that you want to avoid. As Quine once said, my mentor and hero, Van Orman Quine, once said that he spoke of organisms that had the pathetic but praiseworthy penchant for dying without leaving offspring. That is indeed the feature on which evolution depends. And if you get it wrong, you're apt to be an early lunch for somebody else, not leave any ancestors. Our ancestors have been concerned about truth for billions of years, in other words. They just didn't realize it. Now, much more recently, that is, looking over the billions of years, once we get to the vertebrates and the bigger, fancier vertebrates, we see that some species, some primates, not just Homo sapiens, but plausibly some cetaceans, some whales, some dolphins, and some birds may appreciate false belief, the difference between having a true belief, having a false belief, between another animal's having a true belief and having a false belief. There's some very interesting research on this right now. But in general, the appreciation of the search for truth is simply beyond the capacity of non-human species. But we can get close. A very well-studied phenomenon in evolutionary biology is the advertisement of toxicity by poisonous species. They tend to be very brightly colored. So if you see something bright orange, very brightly colored, don't eat it. That's the point, and it is warning. After all, the poison doesn't do it any good if it simply kills the predator that kills it. So in order for poison to be a useful ploy in the arms race of evolution, you have to give advance warning. So you advertise. And of course, you tell the truth. Say, look out, I'm poisonous. But of course, where there are truth tellers around, there are going to be liars too. So false advertising has also evolved many times in response to this. We get what's called the Batesian mimicry by non-poisonous species, who are getting a free ride on the truth-telling of the poisonous species. These issues have been very well explored by evolutionary biologists. A related and even closer to human concerns category is the Zahavi principle, put forward first by Ahmet Zahavi, and roundly resisted for many years by some biologists, now more or less accepted. Zahavi put forward the view that only costly advertising can be credible. That if you can fake it cheap, you will, and that will destroy the meaning of the signal in general. The principle could be expressed this way: I'm so good that I can afford this huge cost and still survive. Some of the examples are examples of sexual selection, thus the peacock's tail is a famous instance of this, where the handicap principle, as it's sometimes called, seems to apply. The peacock is saying, I can carry this great, big, ridiculous tail around with me and still avoid predation and still keep my health up. You have to be a healthy, strong bird to do that. I've got good genes. That's presumably the message sent by the peacock's tail. But it's not just intraspecific courtship signaling of this sort. Another behavior that has been given this analysis is those wonderful leaps called stotting that are done by antelopes. You've seen the films on television with the herd of antelopes being chased by the lion or the hyenas, and every now and then one antelope will just leap tremendously up in the air. It's a great, huge leap in the air. What on earth is that for? Remember, you're asking the cui bono question. What is that for? That's an expenditure of energy. What's paying for that? What good is that doing? The good it is doing is that it is telling the predator, chase one of my cousins. I am so fast and strong that I can throw these ridiculous leaps in the air and you still can't catch me. So don't waste your energy. And this has been pretty well confirmed as the right explanation. Now, of course, human culture has, in most of these cases, what animals have discovered the long, slow way by natural selection, human culture has also come along and reinvented. And we all know this principle from advertising. With a name like Smucker's, you've got to be good. That is the way to remember the Zahavi principle. So, truth and falsehood have been tracked by species on this planet for millions of years. But language changed everything. When language evolved, we entered new realms of possibility with regard to the tracking of truth and falsehood. As Talleyrand once said, language was invented so that we can conceal our thoughts from each other. Whole new dimensions of arms races of deceit and counter-deceit, deceit detection and the detection of deceit detection, and so forth arise. We're the species that discovered doubt. Now, other species can be seen to be disturbed by uncertainty. Have I got enough food for the winter? Is my mate cheating on me? Is it time to move south? Is it safe to enter this cave? They can be seen to be faced with questions of this sort and responding to them with some measure of difficulty. But what they can't do is they can't actually ask themselves these questions. They can't actually explicitly pose these questions. And because they can't pose the questions to themselves, not having language, they cannot consider their doubts as objects in the world that have their own properties. It is the capacity, once you have language, to become reflective about your own reflections and to create surrogate perceptual objects then to study in your own good time. That is, I think, the key to the huge increase in subtlety with regard to truth that our species has encountered. What we did, in other words, is we invented culture. And culture has many objects which play particular roles in helping us with our epistemic problems. Maps, for instance, measuring of all sorts, the measuring of time, the measuring of space, the measuring of weight, the measuring of amounts, all kinds of measuring. Writing, tremendous boon, of course. And all of these innovations come with a built-in ideal, and that is truth. That's what they depend on. And so, in the same way that other artifacts depend on lubrication or energy, so these cultural innovations depend on the distinction between truth and falsehood, and the bias in favor of truth. The appearance-reality distinction is, I think, something that the human species discovered. I don't think other species ever really get to the point of being able to appreciate that there's a difference between how things seem to be and how they really are. The level of sophistication required to think about this and do something about it depends on human culture. And leads, in turn, to ever greater capacities for reflective self-improvement. It struck me a few years ago that a phrase which is often used as a joke, as a sort of forlorn expression of stupidity, might actually be turned around and seen to be a triumphal expression of intelligence. Well, it seemed like a good idea at the time. We've all encountered this in its sort of joking context, where this is the rueful response you make to one stupid mistake or another that you've made. I want to draw your attention to just how sophisticated it is as a thought. In order to think this thought, in order to be able to think this thought, you have to have episodic memory. You have to be able to recall what it was like at some earlier time. And not just recall what the weather was like and the food was like. You've got to be able to recall what was going on in your head. You've got to be able to think about how it seemed to you at the time. You have to have the appearance-reality distinction and the capacity to reflect on how you didn't get it right that time. This rueful remark is, if you like, the preamble, the prolegomenon to fixing things, to making things better, to improving your design of one thing or another. It is, of course, a process of bootstrapping. And bootstrapping has worked in the past, and it can work in the future. An example which fascinates me is the task of making a straight edge. How do you make a straight edge? If you want to draw a straight line, you go get your handy straight edge and you just hold it down and you draw the line. But where did you get the straight edge? Well, from the straight edge manufacturer. Where did the straight edge manufacturer get the straight edge? Well, from some master straight edge. Well, where did they get that? And you can realize that there's a threatened sort of infinite regress there. But of course, it's not an infinite regress. It's a finite regress. And it's a finite regress of some actual, I think, theoretical interest. Because what happened is that over the thousands of years, straight edges got better and better and better and better as a result of human bootstrapping. You start by just rubbing two stones together. And then you realize that if you can use three stones, you can eliminate a certain sort of error. And then you gradually get better and better straight edges. And you eventually get to a straight edge like this one. Here, this is from a 1970 book by Moore on foundations of mechanical accuracy. So this is circa 1970. It says the box straight edge, I don't know if you can read this, is the best design. It's extremely rigid. Its 90-degree form is self-proving, and it is relatively insensitive to temperature change. Well, now in 1970, they were worried about the deflections from a straight edge you get by putting your hand, your warm hand, on a thing of that size, and the local deflections you might get from straight over a period of a few minutes. And of course that leads then to instruments which allow you to magnify those differences. And this jaggy line, that shows the a million times magnification of a particular machined straight edge. And what you can see from this process is that over time, the methods get better and better, and they permit us to use the very process of bootstrapping to help us define the ideal, the perfectly straight line. I submit we have no trouble at all with the conception of a perfectly straight line. And in fact, for several thousand years, this has been our ideal of knowledge. Geometry has, since Plato's day, and actually probably before that, been our very ideal of perfect knowledge. Absolute, uncontrovertible, incontrovertible, perfectly certain knowledge. Then, of course, along came non-Euclidean geometry, and one has to think again about, well, just what do we mean here? How do we apply these different geometrical systems onto the world? And we can look out and see which one actually fits our world. This process of refinement of knowledge continues to this day. But it really is unquestioned and properly so universal. What's 2 times 17? Yeah. The fact that everybody can get it and can know that everybody else is going to get it, that there's just one right answer, is an easy to overlook fact, but it is a fact. I'm just reminding you actually of obvious things. This is just everyday garden variety truth. And it's relied on by all cultures, by all creeds, by all people, everywhere. Or do you know some church that doesn't use arithmetic to keep track of its donations? I don't think so. I think we can see science as a human enterprise, as, if you like, the technology of truth. Not perfect, but getting better and better, self-correcting, self-proving in all sorts of ways, and demonstrating to anybody who wants to look again and again the powers that it is capable of in the truth-seeking department when it's done right. So now I want to return to the idea of memes, and I want to suggest that we're living in a wonderful age precisely because this fact about science is now available to everybody. The cat is out of the bag. There's no way that enforced ignorance can win in the long run. You can't uneducate people. You can try. As communications technology makes it harder and harder for leaders to shield their people from outside information, as the economic realities of the 21st century make it clearer and clearer that education is the most important investment any parent can make in a child, the floodgates are opening all over the world, and of course the effects are tumultuous. All the flotsam and jetsam of popular culture, all the trash and scum that accumulates in the corners of a free society will inundate relatively pristine regions along with the treasures. So you don't just get the treasures of modern education, equal rights for women, better health care, workers' rights, democratic ideals, openness to the cultures of others. You also get all the junk that lies around in our culture. As the experience in the former Soviet Union shows only too clearly, the worst features of capitalism and high tech are among the most robust replicators in this population explosion of memes. And there will be plenty of grounds for xenophobia, for Luddism, for the tempting hygiene of backwards-looking fundamentalism wherever this explosion hits. In his wonderful book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, Jared Diamond shows, with very carefully amassed scholarship, how germs, more than guns and steel, led to the conquest of the Western Hemisphere by the Europeans. It was all those germs that Westerners had become accommodated to, germs that grew out of millennia of living in close contact with domesticated animals from whom these disease pathogens had traveled, that led to the overwhelming effect when Europeans arrived in the Western Hemisphere. And I want to suggest that we now have to consider in the 21st century a parallel problem of what might be called toxic ideas. We have become immune to the excesses of a free culture, to the pornography and advertising and trivia and all of that. We've learned how to live with it and how to put it off to the side, to tolerate it. We should not suppose that people in every culture will be as tolerant of or as immune to these toxic ideas as we are. I'm sure that in recent months, many of us have felt for the first time a certain dread fear as we contemplate the question of those fanatical Al-Qaeda ideas infecting the minds of young boys in Islam in various parts of the world. And we should stop, though, and reflect on, in a way, how much scarier it must be for the Muslims to see the much more infectious ideas of our culture being enthusiastically adopted by their children. Our ideas, the ideas of high-tech and popular culture and jeans, blue jeans, and all of that is much more infectious, spreads much more readily than the ideas of Al-Qaeda. These seductive, the magical technology. It is small wonder that many people are simply scared of these ideas as they face them. As I say, we've developed immunity to them. We should be alert to the fact that other people haven't, and they may need special help in controlling the explosion of these ideas in their cultures. The truth can hurt. Just one very simple example about the Panari Indians in Venezuela. The Panari were really Stone Age, living a Stone Age existence until very recently. And as one anthropologist says, in the past, when stone axes were used, various individuals came together and worked communally to fell trees for a new garden. With the introduction of the steel axe, however, one man can clear a garden by himself. Collaboration is no longer mandatory, nor particularly frequent. Now you think that's just a steel axe. A simple bit of technology already more than 1,000 years old to us. And yet it revolutionizes the culture when it's introduced there. Well, what should we do? I submit that the principle of informed consent has simply got to be maintained as the key pivot. It is one of the cornerstones of liberty. And we simply must not permit our fellow human beings to prohibit other fellow human beings from getting informed. We should not be mistaken about the fact that once they're informed, this will change their cultures drastically. There's no putting the cat back in the bag. But we cannot adopt the sort of paternalism which says these people are to be kept uninformed. They are to be hidden away in a preserve of some kind, and all the facts that we know about the 21st century are going to be concealed from them. Now, we're getting into some very controversial water now. I want to tell you a little story about some American researchers that introduced a virus into a third world country. This virus damaged the ecology. It raised infant mortality rates. It led to a decline in health, especially the health of women and children. And probably worst of all, it undermined the only effective political force for democracy in that country. When these researchers were confronted with the effects, the putative effects of their work, their response was frustrating, to say the least. They said, no, all things considered, what we've done is in the interests of the people. You're applying inappropriate Western standards to these people. Don't blame us. This is the way they like it, and the leaders in this country, moreover, supported that, said that's right. Little was heard in this country from those who might have been said by Western standards to have suffered. Well, now, who were these American researchers who introduced this virus? Were they perhaps agribusiness chemists taking some new insecticide or fertilizer, polluting someplace with it? Were they biologists creating genetically modified foods? Were they perhaps doctors trying out risky vaccines? No. What I have in mind was this. They were postmodernist science critics. And what they were doing was spreading the idea that Western science is just another meme. It's a colonial imposition on the native culture. Now, if you haven't heard this particular story, of course, I made it up, but only by putting together real stories that have happened in many countries in the very recent past. I'm just going to draw your attention to a few articles on this. I'll put these up again afterwards. Mira Nanda's piece in a book, A House Built on Sand, Exposing Postmodernist Myths About Science, which I highly recommend. Reza Afshari, an essay on Islamic cultural relativism and the discourse on human rights. Susan Oken's piece, Is Multiculturalism Bad for Women? And Pervez Hoodboy's Islam and Science, Religious Orthodoxy, and the Battle for Rationality. I think these issues are very controversial, and I don't think I've said the last word or even anything more than just a first word. But I think it's very important that we think about the impact of our scientific culture on the rest of the world from the perspective, from an evolutionary perspective that allows us to see the costs and benefits of these introductions. I'm going to end with a quotation that I love from my good friend Ed Wilson. Scientists, being held responsible for what they say, have not found postmodernism useful. Thank you very much for your attention.